for me, very important one, particularly in the light of what's happening.
Recording in progress.
So if we look at what is happening in the world today, then while a lot of focus is on President Trump, on the tariff wars he has launched, the kind of technology wars that have been already on for quite some time, what was originally called as the chip wars, because it started with really sanctions on China for America's export of chips to China, and also associated equipment which could lead to the production of high-end chips. From chip wars now it became trade war, and it has also become what is being referred to as the rare earths war, which China has really imposed on the United States, that if you are going to do what you're doing to us in terms of technology sanctions, then we have also certain areas in which we are strong enough to retaliate. Now, this is only a very narrow part of the picture. The much larger part of the picture, and I'm going to take you first to the political, economic part of it before I come to the technology aspect of it, technology, science, knowledge, society aspect of it. So I will start by simply laying before you the proposition that what we are seeing is the simultaneous end of two eras in our history. One era is clearly what is called the American Imperium, where America post Second World War becomes the dominant power in the world. For some time, they were also the only nuclear power, but for a very short period. They thought it would last for a long time, but it really didn't. Soviet Union was also built the nuclear bomb soon after, and also other countries have followed suit in the last 50, 60 years. So that was a very short nuclear monopoly that they had post the Second World War, and particularly dropping the two nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But after that, they have been the dominant science, technology, economic power, as well as the political power of the last 60 years. Little more than 60 years, about 70, 75 years. But what people have not noticed or haven't registered, there is a much larger change that is taking place along with it, which is that the West, what is called the West, which is really a few European countries, in Western Europe, and the United States, along with Canada and Australia, if you will, a bunch of colonial, ex-colonial, and settler colonial powers. This were what they thought was the dominant force in the world. This rise of the colonial powers we are talking about, the European powers, if you will, really came into prominence in 1700. But the rise, as I will just take you a little behind that as well, is really from when Columbus discovers Americas. Really, he discovered some Caribbean islands, but that's opened the way to the Americas. And 200 years of genocidal violence of the Americas, which allowed particularly Spain, also Portugal, to mine silver. Spain actually controlled the silver, and that was something which led to a huge change in the economy of the world, not to the political economy, not to the politics as yet, but meant to the political economy of the world. Suddenly, a bunch of West European countries seem to have the ability, which the United States has today, to print dollars. Similarly, they could mint silver coins, and silver was the global currency of trade. Gold was much more expensive, Gold coins, therefore, were more difficult to use in everyday transaction, though these are not everyday transactions, they were large transactions. So first was silver, which is what Spain gets a monopoly, which it then spends for its military purposes in Europe. It spends it to buy goods from Dutch, the French, the British, other countries essentially in Europe, and also to buy goods, of course, to fund the trade that takes place in China and South Asia, India, essentially. So if we look at that, you will see the European powers were not trying to go to Americas, discover new lands. They were just trying to come to India and China because that's where the production at that time was taking place. India also had spices. China, as we know later, also had tea, a monopoly over tea. But essentially, it was a hunt for spices, textiles, silk, ceramics. These were the main trade goods that they were interested in, European countries were interested in. And Arabs controlled the trade before that, both by land and by sea, because Europe, they had to go through Arabian controlled areas, both in terms of, as I said, the oceans, the Red Sea, for example, the Persian Gulf, or the Indian Ocean. All of it was at that point of time really controlled by the basically the Arab merchants who had their beat right up to China. China at one point also had a lot of what are called junks, which are really large ships, which they used for trade, and they were quite common both in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean trade, except that China withdrew from this at some point. I'm not going to go into this history, but I'm just trying to tell you that before 17th century, these powers that we are talking about, which think they control the world still, they were really not powerful, not in the picture, and they were desperate to trade with India and China and Southeast Asia for both manufactured goods as well as goods like spices, sugar, and so on. Without going into the details of that, what I will come to is that world in which about 8 countries sort of became dominant players in the world. Some from Europe, and of course the United States, possibly Canada as well. These became the major players. Australia on this side wants to be, but still is a relatively weaker power. But these became the dominant political and economic powers in the world. How did that happen? As I said, one of us was silver, then of course the ocean trade, in which they ended up controlling the oceans. And the land empires till 1700 or so were still very powerful, controlled most of the globe. They really did not think oceans were important except for trade. They didn't think of it as a naval military power. And that's the mistake, for instance, Indian rulers made when they allowed British to set up what are called the forts, Fort William, Calcutta, in Chennai, as well as in Bombay. And they thought it was only for trade, but as we know, the history of India is very clear that British then became the colonial power and then commanded the riches of India for expansion of its trade and economy. Now, I'll come quickly to this end, why I'm saying this is ending, because what we are seeing is a reassertion, though a slow one, but a reassertion of Asia, for example. It's not just India or China, it's also Southeast Asia. Not so much West Asia as yet, because as we know, West Asia is facing relatively difficult times with the kind of military forces that have been unleashed by the West, of course using the agency of Israel. But all of this, it makes that Asia is becoming a major player. Now, the other major players could be Latin America and Africa. Economically, they're not as large as, for instance, China and India is. They Latin American players or even the African players. But there's no question that they are also powers which do not want Western hegemony. And for instance, in Africa, the French have been kicked out for a number of their ex-colonies, which they still control even 40, 30 years of supposedly giving these countries independence. So you see neo-colonization, which continued after formal colonies ended, is also in that sense being beaten back in Africa. And of course, the United States would still like to control Latin America. Mr. Trump is very clear on that. That's why the kind of attack on Brazil, for example, Brazil is the biggest political power in the region, that is taking place as well. But what I want to bring before you, that's not simply the end of the United States as the global hegemon, but it's also the end of this new colonial transformation of the world, which took place really from 1700 to 2000. Before that, yes, the Americas suffered hugely because of continuing genocide, destruction of the societies, taking their lands over, making them initially slave plantations, and over a period of time using that to build particularly North American and West European capital. So when you talk about the modern world, and I'll come to what the West says and what we should think about, I think that modern world in which a handful of European ex-colonial and neo-colonial powers, United States, Canada, Australia being three of them, their regime is coming to an end, and that is the new war that Mr. Trump has started, saying, okay, we don't control technology anymore, and I'll come to why they don't. We don't control production anymore. Most of the production now takes place outside advanced capitalist countries, but we still have the dollar. And we control the financial flows in the world. Most of the financial institutions are either American or in partnership with America, European. So since we control the global finance, we still can control the world, and Trump's tariffs essentially are a trade war. But the purpose of it is not trade. The purpose of it is really political dominance over the world using trade. Whether it can succeed or not is a good question today for me, because I think that needs a different discussion. But let me put it very honestly, that I don't think that when you are able to produce controlling trade or finance, you can beat back countries. Yes, maybe for some time, maybe for a brief period in some regions, yes, but globally, it's not possible in today's terms to be able to control the world simply by control over finance, because ultimately what controls the world is who produces, not who controls the money, but who produces the goods. And that's why not only labor, but also productive forces are so important in anything that we talk about. And since I am a Marxist, so I will go back to my fundamental premise that productive forces determine who controls the productive forces, the classes that control the productive forces. The struggle over the productive forces is also the struggle over the economy of the countries and the politics of the countries. And increasingly, we can see that the ex-colonial and the neo-colonial powers are weakening precisely in those areas. They're no longer able to produce, and they're no longer able to create new scientific knowledge. Now, that is the basic background today. So I'll come back to my question, that what is it we are seeing today? And if we take the political battle that's taking place today is being fought on the basis of what kind of commodities, who is producing, and what are the economic ways of exchanging those commodities in the world today. If we see that, then we will see two things which are very important in terms of the economy, in terms of the future of the world, in future of production, and not only future of production, but since global warming is a very real example of what's going to happen unless we are willing to change the way we are doing things, it also can mean a huge blow to civilization and humanity itself. So this is not a minor issue. It's also confronting us every day as we find temperatures rising, areas which did not face droughts facing droughts. We are finding what I call extreme climate events increasing more and more, and it's affecting not only us, but all countries across the globe, including the advanced capitalist countries. Now, if you take all of that into account, I will go back to my premise that what is changing in the world is both the technology that countries like India, China, because China is the leader of producing a huge number of these technologies, but also many other countries who are able to contribute productively in a way they were not earlier. And the terms of production, how they produce, what kind of goods they produce, means increasingly the advanced capitalist countries are no longer able to compete with them, and it is that competition which they're not able to face, then they are hitting back today, Trump being the key one, of course, but the European Union has been also trying that with the various free trade agreements that they are reaching with us. We have one with UK, we have signed recently. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but all of that is meant to see how can we keep these countries down using our political and financial power. But let's look at concretely the areas that have come up in technology terms and how does it determine our future. While a lot of talk has gone on about chips, AI and so on, let's also look at that fundamentally the huge change that is taking place right now in energy terms. If you see what industrial capitalism grew out of, it was out of what would be called the coal revolution. That coal and steam were the motive powers of industrial revolution. So really, if you talk about textiles, then it's really not steam engines. It was really initially the water power, the water wheel that turned the machines. But soon after, it really became steam engines, which take over industrial production, and post the industrial revolution, as it is called, the textile revolution really becomes also about steam engines. Now, the picture that is given to most people, including when we are students, and probably to most people in the world today who carry that image, which the West tries to call age of discovery. They discovered India, they discovered Africa, they discovered Americas, even though people lived there. America was also discovered by Columbus, in spite of the fact that 80 million people living in the Americas at that time. So we'll not talk about how laughable this is, but they claim that because they went there, somehow it was discovered. But leaving that out, they certainly did expand navigation around the world. We have to give that credit to the Portuguese, particularly, who came to from India to Southeast Asia as well, rounding Africa. So this meant that the entire Asia, the trade, was now open to Portuguese in a big way. It was followed by the French, the Dutch, and the British as well, who then take over really large parts of the global trade, and using that also become the major colonial powers. So without going too much into this history, what I would like to focus on is that though we have a picture that industrial revolution steam engine drove the textile mills and that made it cheaper. The reality is very different. The reality is Indian textiles were used, they were imported in large amounts into Europe, and Europe, particularly countries like England, who were the major importers, by the East India Company in India, also the Dutch, for example, the French also, all of them had equivalent companies. The Dutch VOC was very important. It was the equivalent of the East India Company for the Dutch, and they were very important in Southeast Asia. But the point that I was making here is that actually it wasn't that machine power made British in textiles cheaper than India. It wasn't. In fact, Indian textiles into Europe, British being really the Dwarapalikas over there, the guardians who control the trade, they had to impose 10 times to 11 times the value of the goods, something like 90 to 100% tax, 900% tax, in order to stop Indian cloth being imported into Britain and also Europe, because they were by the time controlling the Indian trade. Now this was the basis of their industrial revolution. Not steam engines, not advanced textile machinery, but simply the fact that through control of Calcutta, Bombay, Chennai, they were really controlling India trade by that time, and all the Indian trade that was going in was really going in via Europeans, particularly the British. Also, they used textiles in large quantities to buy slaves from Africa, and these slaves then are used in the plantations in the Caribbean, first for sugar and then later for textiles. Textiles because cotton was grown in United States, the southern states which had slavery, and that cotton really came in and was used by the cotton mills in England, Lancashire and other cotton, Manchester, Lancashire and other cotton industrial towns. So this picture of the world by which technology interacts with society is sought to be given a different garb. What is the thing that we are told? That enlightenment led to science, science led to technology, technology led to industrial revolution in England. The picture is very different. Industrial revolution takes place by first protection of the markets from countries like India. It takes place because they are able to protect their market, but others can't. It happens because then the advances they can make are then used after a protected market, when they're able to build textile machines, advance their technology. Then, by the time they destroyed the textile industry in India in a large measure, because we lost our complete export market. Then they, by that time, by virtue of various things which I'm not going to go into details, they're able to destroy the Indian textile industry and then make India essentially a country which sells raw materials, cotton, but imports textile goods. So this destruction that takes place is something which colonialism does in every continent, in every country. It enslaves. It makes the modern world not about how they advanced technology, but how they advanced military control, and primarily the Navy, which gave them an edge, and how their organization of war perhaps was more quote-unquote capitalist and therefore modern than what the feudal forces in India or other places would do. And China was even worse because they destroyed their own navy, and then of course they were forced to buy opium from the British forces. War took place, the Opium Wars, and of course the opium was grown in what is called Bengal presidency, but really UP and Bihar. And that opium is what then makes China fight opium wars. It loses and then has to fight the national liberation struggle to finally beat back the imperial powers. So why I'm saying all of this is while we think this is a history of technology and science that we should be talking about, it's really political economy that we are talking about. And political economy encompasses also knowledge both of nature and also knowledge of how to change nature, which is technology. So when we talk about all of this, we must understand that science and technology, knowledge and technology are not separate from politics, but very much integral to the politics of the world. So when we look at, for instance, AI and energy transition we are having, which is what I'm going to talk about immediately after this, that we are really talking about a much larger political battle between emerging countries, which are colonies earlier, and that means really most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, against about 8 countries which controlled the world till about 10, 15, 20 years back. So this is the transition that we are seeing, a double transition, if you will, of both the political economy, the trade, etc., but also the science and technology domain, which now is no longer the preserve of the ex-colonial powers, of the secular colonial powers, but a number of other countries are also now becoming competitors, if you will, in that sphere as well. So let's go back to what we see currently and how do we analyze the Trump war on the rest of the world, and how do you analyze what countries like India or China can do? Clearly, we are, as India particularly, we have been hit in our external market, of which United States was a very significant one. United States has talked about the balance of trade being against them, that we have a huge surplus in balance of trade. What they don't talk about, of course, is that if you take, for instance, the other items of exchange, money, which goes out and comes into the country, then there is a huge outflow that goes out of the country for the United States. One of it is we pay a huge money in terms of what is called property rights, patents, copyright, etc. India pays a huge amount of money for that. Secondly, multinationals operating in India take their profits out. But obviously that is also an outflow from the Indian economy to the Americans and the Europeans. So it's not that India is, you have to only look at physical goods to see what is happening. You have to look at also Google's revenue in India, not taxed. Amazon, software companies who sell their license in India, like Microsoft, that if we take all this into account, we will find that India and America's balance of payments is actually not in India's favor. At best, it is marginally in America's favor. In fact, India earns its foreign exchange not from the United States, but really from West Asia, because a number of Indians who have gone there, worked there, want to send their money back to India because they're not going to settle down there. Unlike the H-1B visa holders who go from India to the United States, but want to settle in the United States as US citizens. So given that, the Indians who go to America are not the ones who send money back. It's really Indian labor, workers, middle class employees who go to West Asia who send their money home. And that's how India actually balances its books. Because otherwise, given the fact that it imports still a lot of oil from other countries, it imports still a lot of machinery, advanced goods from West, India would be a deficit economy we'd be short of foreign exchange if we did not get the money coming from the Gulf, particularly since Kerala is a very important part of that. This is what I would like to bring to your notice, that it is not what is being said by the Americans, that we are ripping off the Americans. No. In fact, the balance of payments, if you take all payments into account, is actually virtually zero. That means neither US nor India has a deficit if we take all elements of transfer into account. But the US is very clever in its propaganda. So it only talks about trade. It doesn't talk about, for instance, copyright, other revenues, intellectual property right revenues. It doesn't talk about repatriation of profits from the Indian market. All of that it doesn't talk about. So whatever they gain, which is their positive khata, if you will, in their books, that is not mentioned. What is not positive, what is negative is the only thing the United States want to do. Essentially, if you take the larger picture into account, it's really trying to use the dollar to re-establish its control, which is increasingly losing. But as we know from the Trump wars, this is not working either. And as most people have said, it's a question of waiting this out for a little longer, because in the long term, this is not going to work. Now, why is it that India's trade with United States is relatively such that we can be replaced by many other countries, like Vietnam, like Philippines, like Indonesia, like Bangladesh? So a variety of items that are sold to the United States from India, it appears that they have alternatives. So they can play one against the other and say, okay, 50% tax on you, 20% tax on others. Now immediately it puts us at a disadvantage because others are there. So this brings back to the fundamental premise of what self-reliance should mean for us and what is the relevance of self-reliance today. Because what we are talking about as self-reliance is the ability to manufacture anything we want ourselves and to be able to be an equal player in trading, in any trade we do. So, as I have said with the United States is not playing on that pitch at all. They are not in the game of saying, is our trade equal? What we are getting, is it equal to what we should be getting in terms of the value? What they're saying is, we hold the dollar. We are the foremost military power in the world. They have, I think their military budget is equal to 9 of the next country's military budget. So that's the size of the military budget. How effective that budget is a different issue. But it's really still makes US the largest military power in the world, and that's really not open to question. Given all of that, they're saying now we want to convert all of this finally to economics. We want rent. We want you to pay to us, and the effective part of the tariff war is that if we want to sell to them, that American people finally will have to pay more. But more important than that, if we want to retain our market share, we might have to depress our ex-factory cost significantly. Otherwise, those who have lower tariffs will obviously take over the market. So it's a way to beat down India economically, but it is also a way to beat us down politically. What US is saying, don't try to be our equal. You have to submit to us, become like the European Union who has submitted to us. You have to submit to us. The fact that you want to be our partner in Asia makes no difference to us because you're really not a partner. You can only be a subservient power which listens to what we're saying and pays us tax, what is in Bombay or Calcutta would be called as hafta. If there are strong men around in the localities, you have to pay hafta to them. That's called protection money. You have to pay protection money to the United States. This is the message they are trying to give to us. Now, I would like to talk about why is it that when China seems to be able to weather this American attack, including the chip war attack that was launched on them, why is it that we seem to be on a weaker wicket? And let's not make any bones about it. We are on a weaker wicket, and that's because since the 90s, we have actually officially jettisoned self-reliance. We don't talk about self-reliance, whatever its meaning should be, that I'll come to a little later. But we're no longer talking about self-reliance. What we have talked about is that instead of self-reliance, we will participate in the market, we can buy any knowledge we want, we can produce any goods that we want, and we don't need to look at technology, because technology, like any other commodity, can be bought from the market. Now it transpires that is not strictly true. The technology is not easy to buy. And as the Europeans and the Americans are discussing, for example, say in renewables, particularly electrical vehicles, which is the first and foremost battle that is taking place in market terms in Europe, in the United States, in the rest of the world, it appears that the Chinese companies have built the entire supply chain for electric vehicles, from batteries to electric motors, to anything you name it, they seem to have done it. And that supply chain means that other countries have a problem, particularly as some of the elements of that chain are made only by the Chinese. And that, what has been talked about, the rare earths, it's not really the rare earths we are talking about, but a set of rare earths which go into making electromagnets, which are important from your cell phones to, for instance, the electric vehicles, to also these magnets are important in wind turbines, whole variety of applications. These magnets, which are relatively more efficient than others, make the electric motors more efficient, particularly if you have a cell phone. And it does, by the way, also has little small motors which make the focus work for your camera. Then that, if it is energy guzzling, what it would mean is your charge would go on very quickly. So you have to plug in and recharge more and more. Now that, of course, means that, say the point problem is there with the car as well. If the car battery drains out quickly because the motor is not, electric motor that drives the car is not very efficient, then of course you have to recharge much more. As you know, the recharging frequency is one of the reasons that, for instance, in America, where Americans tend to drive long distances, they stay outside cities, they come from really what would be called really outskirts of the city, even beyond, and they come from there to the city every day. So effectively, they are very worried that will the charge run out and then they are stranded in the middle of nowhere. So because of that, the efficiency of the electric motor is very important, because that gives you what is the driving distance of the car. And if the driving distance of the car for one charge, battery charge, is low, then the cars will not be able to replace the petrol or diesel vehicles, what are called the fossil fuel vehicles. So given that the ones who control the electromagnets do control a section of the economy today, and unfortunately for all of us, that the Chinese have invested in it in a way that for one of the really important elements which go into the electric motor, they have about 99.9% control over its production. So, not in everything, but in this kind of electric magnets, they at this moment have a monopoly. And given the speed at which they're developing, the EVs particularly, it doesn't appear that the Europeans or the Americans are really going to be able to compete. So therefore, if they want to compete, then China also in the technology war has a, shall I say, a chip in the game. Now that brings me to chips. This was the original tech war really. Before I start with how this tech war started, let me take one step back further. The World Trade Organization was created with the understanding all trade barriers would be removed and there would be negotiations of what the tariffs of each set of countries, depending on how poor they were, how economically developed they were, what is the protection they could provide for their markets, and those protections would be negotiated differently, for instance, for agriculture, differently for different kinds of products, for instance, medicines, but be negotiated in WTO, the World Trade Organization that came into being in 2003. Now, United States is the one who's currently scuttling the WTO completely. Why? Because they feel that the premise of that was they would control advanced technology in the world. If they control advanced technology, then they will control the terms of trade in the world and they will be exporting advanced technology goods while others will be exporting raw materials or less advanced technology goods, and that way they will be able to keep their dominance over the world economically. Now, the joker in the pack for them was, of course, countries like China, of course, but also countries like India climbed up the technology ladder. Unfortunately for India, and I'll come to India just a little bit later, I'm also looking at the time, I should not take too much of your time. So if countries like India, for instance, Turkey, countries like Southeast Asia who banded together economically as an economic bloc, if all of these today are able to advance technologically, become competitors to the United States and the European Union, who thought they're well in advance of the others, then what happens to their economies? Because their economies have been built essentially on the premise that they will be able to sell advanced goods and import low-tech goods from the other countries. Now, if low-tech countries becomes advanced as well technologically, then what is it they can exchange with us in lieu of the goods that they go to buy from us? So United States decided that WTO was no longer helping it, and therefore it needed to wage different forms of economic war on different sets of countries, and it started pulling out of WTO by not allowing what is called the trade dispute body. The highest body in there is a tribunal, which there's an appellate body which sits over the tribunal decisions. That unfortunately has a number of people, 4 or 5 I think, and they need the consent of certain countries, out of which US consent is required. And US has not allowed in the last 5 years, I think, to have anybody who can sit on that appellate body. So you can take a trade dispute to WTO, yes, it will be heard, opinions will be given, and after that, if you appeal to the appellate body, then of course the appellate body does not exist. So effectively, the trade dispute resolution in WTO no longer functions. It still functions, it still talks, can set basic tariffs. People may or may not follow it, but the United States has virtually decided it's not in its interest. So all the trade wars we are talking about are in violation of WTO. Nobody talks about it because the US started it against China first. Now it has started against the whole of the world. And since we do not have an appellate body, appealing to WTO has become infructuous. So this is the other part of the trade war which we are not talking about. We are de facto accepted the WTO no longer exists, and it is a free-for-all, each country for itself, and has to negotiate with all the rest of the countries. Obviously, in this, the United States is the major rogue player, which is willing to say that you pay us more, and doesn't matter what you do or say, you have to pay us the hafta, you have to pay us our share. And that is the only way we'll balance our books inside the country. We'll give tax exemptions for the rich and make it up with taxing other countries for their trade. Now, whether that works or not is a different issue. I'm not getting into that today. But all I'm saying is the WTO as a pillar of the global economy no longer exists. We have a free-for-all economy at the moment in terms of external trade. So what then gives you the ability to negotiate this world? One is, of course, negotiate with countries who do not behave like the United States, which are willing to trade with you on a rational basis. What would be called what used to negotiate inside WTO, that on that basis we can negotiate with Southeast Asia, we can negotiate with RCEP group of countries, we can negotiate with African groups of countries, and yes, it is possible to have this kind of trade being done. Still leaves out the question of dollar, which I'll come to last. But the essential part of all of this is that we then have to look at what is it that we can do, what is it other countries can do, and how do we really advance our technology. Each of the countries, how does it share technology and knowledge in a way that we don't get a world in which another United States can emerge. Now, that brings back to the question of self-reliance. Now, I will also say that self-reliance in today's world does not mean that you do everything yourself. As I said, for continental-sized economies, it's possible to even think of self-reliance that you can do everything yourself, but it is not possible for 95% of the countries of the world to do that. So what is it that they can do? What is it that we can do? It's really the ability to, in the whole gamut of technologies, industrial production, if you will, to carve out areas where you also hold what we call unique advantages. It could be part geographical, but also technology always means also knowledge. That you have the knowledge to be able to compete on equal terms with the world only if you have certain kinds of commodities which you have mastered in more than others. That means in the business of give and take, you have something to give and something to take. It's not that you have nothing to give, but you only have to take, because if you do that, then in a bargaining world, which is the non-WTO world we are entering, you don't bring any chips in the game. If you consider it like a gambling game, what are the chips you have? So in this trade, it means that you must be able to also develop technologies which then you can exchange for other technologies. Now, if you take, for example, what is India's capability. Now, even today, Indian science and technology has a huge base. We have a huge technology science base in the country. The problem with that base is if you take institutions, which I have seen for the last 50 years, then most of these institutions are starved of funds in terms of advancing technology, infrastructure for their institution. They're expensive. Science, technology advances require a lot of money, a lot of infrastructure, and continuous upgrading of that infrastructure. I'm not going into personal reminiscence on that, but I can tell you that IITs were at one point advanced in terms of their infrastructure. They no longer are. if you take, for instance, a number of institutions in Asia, and that's not only China, but also other institutions, then IITs today have not advanced their infrastructure to in the way they should have if they had to become globally competitive. Globally competitive meaning in ability to produce students who would know the cutting edge of technology. Now, as I said, you would not know about it, know everything in every field. But there must be areas, carve-outs, where you are considered as a premium player in the world in both science and in technology. Unfortunately, we had that position, we could have had that position. In the 90s, we gave it up. We gave it up in the belief, what the Indian capital also believed in, technology can be bought in a market. It's like any other goods, commodities. But people understand the monopoly value of technology, and I'll come to my last point on that very quickly. That understand that monopoly over knowledge is not something which is to be parted or only money. It is something which builds a much larger leverage in the economy, and therefore it's protected by copyright and by patents. This is how it is protected, and the protection of that is what gives them then the edge in terms of money. Now, of course, in software, we have built in whole commons movement, free software movement, as you know, as it is called, which makes it possible to share software on terms which then becomes a viral license. Any advance you have to share. But the sharing economy worked for software because it was under really what is called, it's called copyleft, but it is really a form of copyright. That's a legal protection. But in terms of scientific knowledge, in patents, terms of other forms of knowledge, which is basically something that you your know-how, you can keep it secret. All those protections are much stronger, and putting it in commons is much, much more legally difficult. So as a consequence, you are still seeing that social advance can be limited by property rights, and how we can bring the commons into the arena of technology, not just technology of software, that's an exception, which is protected, as I said, by copyleft, is really a form of copyright. But how do you make equivalent of patents in the same way is still a legal challenge. But that's really not the major challenge that we have. The major challenge that we have is that supposing we decide that we will share knowledge amongst each other across a set of countries, then the question would be, who is sharing how much? Now, if you ask China, America, you're more advanced, you must give all your technology to us, but we have nothing to give back to you. And that is not something that's going to work in the long run, no. So what you really need to do is that you also need to put something which you're good at and say, okay, I am not good at, say, X, Y, Z things, but I'm good at this thing. And these advances I'll give you if you give me your advances in these areas. So an ability to trade means you have to have then certain areas which you can claim correctly to be one of the global leaders. And this is the battle that's being fought in chips and in rare earths. As I said, China decided that it may not be able to compete on chips, but it had an advanced technology, economy focus on essentially energy. Now, the world has really focused narrowly on artificial intelligence, computer, chips, as if that's the only advanced technology in the world. But it has forgotten that while we do have major breakthroughs in this area, and one should not deny the advances that is taking place, we also have an equally major set of advances that is taking place in energy. First time from fossil fuel, we're moving to renewables. Solar and wind are both renewables. Hydroelectricity is also renewable. We are moving into renewables, and without renewables, the world is likely to face a complete disaster. Leaving that part of it out, the cost of renewables today is lower than the cost of fossil fuels, both in terms of putting plants, capital cost, as well, of course, in running cost, because as you know, natural sun and wind are free. Therefore, you don't really have running costs except maintenance and except whatever battery replacements you might have to make. Of course, there is a question that how do you store energy? Now, fossil fuel has the advantage, it's a store of energy. You can burn it anytime you want, you can increase the burning or you can reduce the burning, and that makes it possible for you to control the storage of energy, not just its production. And then, of course, the batteries have become highly efficient today. Large cost decreases have taken place in batteries, so it is no longer a bottleneck that you cannot store energy or storing energy is expensive. Taking all that into consideration, if you take renewables, including the battery systems, its costs today are less than that of fossil fuels. Now, this is a huge change that has taken place. Yes, China has been the forerunner of this change in terms of bringing the ability to bring costs down for both the wafers, the silicon wafers that we use, also in terms of batteries, also in terms of wind turbines, and also in terms of the capital cost they're willing to put in to make the grid stable and the ability to make surplus power from transfer from one region to another to ultra high voltage grid. Now those investments, which are huge, China has done in a way that other countries can also do. It's not that they have done something unique. They have done something because they saw that without that they would not be not only competitive, but the fossil fuel burning was no longer something which could be sustained in the world. So if you take the United States, then you see the United States wants to focus on fossil fuels. Trump's insistence is oil, gas, coal. If you take China, you take India, they're all transitioning towards basically sun and wind. We also have hydropower, which is not a problem. It's not a problem. We also have nuclear energy. So I will spend some time later, not today, if you want to discuss that, but not today. But anyway, nuclear is not a major form of energy for the grid right now, nor is it likely to be, given its very high capital cost and given that solar and wind costs are decreasing so rapidly. India, we have hydroelectric power. It's also important to know to realize that water can be stored. And we have, for instance, Purulia and West Bengal, under the lieutenant government, we had created reversible hydro storage. Doesn't require too much storage. It's not huge dams because you're only storing energy for the day like a battery. And therefore, at night when the frequency is high, supply can be easily made. You pump water up, and when you need it at peak times, you pump, let the water come down, and that's a reversible hydro electric project which does not need any large flows. It doesn't need water to be added except in significant amounts, which is because of evaporation, because you're really pumping the same water up and down. So given that, this kind of huge storages are possible with not too much disturbance to the locality, because you don't require large storages. You require small storages, and that's enough to give you a large amount of power for a certain short period. So all of this is possible in India, and we certainly can develop solar cells if we put our mind to it. At the moment, this is the big problem that this government, also the earlier Manmohan Singh government, has created. It believes that capitalists will bring technology, put capital, and develop India. Capitalists do not develop technology. They only buy technology for what they need, and after that, the development of technology is not something they're bothered about, because they say, if we need more technology, Ambani, Tata will buy it from the market. And technology is available in the market, they believe, which is not true, but that's a different matter. So when you talk about self-reliance, you have to really look at the entire supply chain, not just one element of the supply chain, which is what China has done for renewables. Not looked at only one element of the supply chain, but the entire element of the supply chain, from how to provide pure silicon, how to purify it, how to convert it into cells, how to have the ability to produce power, not only produce power, store it, the batteries. Panels are easy, okay, just put the cells and you connect it, you get the panels. But cells, yes. Silicon, yes. Providing all those etchings on the silicon, putting stuff in it, yes. All of this they have mastered. And then, of course, the batteries and, of course, the grid. The ultra-high voltage grid they have now got is something which US doesn't have. In fact, one of the biggest problems in both Europe and the United States are the weak grids. So all of it, India, if it wants, it has to look at the entire supply chain. Just like China had its bottleneck with the chips. Not because it couldn't produce the chips, because they don't have the ultra-high lithography, ultraviolet lithography machines, which only the Dutch produce, and the Dutch on that have bought some patents from America, and under that America says you have to listen to what we tell you to do, otherwise we will stop your production. So on that basis, they are not able to get lithography, ultra-high lithography machines from the Dutch. As a consequence, they have been restricted to not being able to produce the some 2 micron, 3 micron level chips, but at the most they can go into 7 nanometer chip designs. And then if you produce that also, the amount, how much, shall we say, chips which pass quality assurance can you produce? The yield becomes important, and without the ultra-high lithography machines, they are not, UV machines, they are not able to maintain the quality of the production, meaning how many chips they are able to produce in a batch successfully also. So they are facing these bottlenecks. Of course, they're putting money into it, they may be able to overcome it, that's a different question. But at the same time, they have also realized that they have some trump cards with them, not Mr. Trump, but they also have some cards in their kitty. And therefore, they have shown that in certain areas, in terms of advances, they are able to match the Americans. They are able to be ahead. And that they have shown that when you come to AI, it's not just the chips, but how you do the AI also matters. And the fact that they have not only built these lightweight models like DeepSeek, but they have made it open sourced. So now all the advanced Chinese AI models are open sourced, they're available to each other, and therefore there's a much larger ecosystem which can help develop these models further. Having done that, it has also put huge pressure on the American companies like OpenAI and so on. How do they fight this? How much do they open their technologies? Can they compete with those technologies which are available, AI models which are available as open source? Can they compete with them? Are they better than them? And the argument that seems to be they are not really better, and in fact, DeepSeek's models seem to be catching up with other models in the field. And if that continues, there are also other open source models from China. If they continue, then what happens? So what I'm saying is that effectively, if you want to compete in this game, and self-reliance is not an autarkic slogan, do everything yourself, but you should be able to have certain things you have developed which you are the world leader. And if you do that, then you can bargain with others to see that they cannot say, okay, I won't give you anything unless you pay me 50% extra tariff, which is what Mr. Trump is telling us. But when it comes to United States and China, Mr. Trump is much softer. Why? China was supposed to be their main enemy. But in trade terms, they are coming now down in India because China holds certain areas, rare earths, in which they are the world leaders. And China holds therefore the cards that if you want to build a F-35, you require rare earths. If you want to build an Apple phone, you require rare earths. If you want to build any electric motor that's there in your fridge, there in number of applications, your cell phones, all of this require this electric motor. And that electric motor at the moment comes from the supply chain which China controls. So it's not important that you control all the supply chains in the world, but you should be able to control a few so that you have bargaining power. By the way, India Pharmaceuticals had once upon a time that power, but unfortunately again, the interest of capital are short term. So they decided you have APIs, which are basically the fundamental bulk drugs we used to call them. And we decided we'll do formulation, bulk drugs we'll buy from China. So that pharmaceutical age which we have, we still make pharmaceuticals much cheaper than others, is no longer available because all the fundamental APIs, as they're called, basically what, as I said, we used to call bulk drugs, they are produced in China today. So China has systematically focused on key areas by which they can control certain technologies, which once upon a time we also controlled, which have given them. It's time that Mr. Modi stops using slogans as policy and starts thinking about what really needs to be done. This government believes that made in India is not the issue, we'll make in India. The difference between made in India and make in India is the knowledge component of it. And make in India is saying, okay, I'll give you 70% of capital, you Micron come and make chips in India. Sure, it becomes quote unquote Indian chips, but they have 100% of ownership while we have provided 70% of the capital. Now this location of the chip making is not the issue. The question is, do we have chips in the game? And that is science and technology knowledge, if you want to have self-reliance. And how do you build that knowledge? Not over a day, not over a month, but over years. India is not that badly off. It still has good science institutions, technology institutions. But if you come to transferring that in market terms to functioning technologies, that link still seems to be extremely weak. And it is not the weakness of the science and technology institutions alone, but the fact that big capital in India believes that we don't have to do this. Since we can build at scale like Ambani can or Adani can, we can buy technology freely in the world. But remember, technology is not buying one turbine, one generator. It's about building a supply chain in which no country should be able to dictate to us, United States, China, Russia, any country. Because if they do, then we have the option to develop that ourselves. We don't necessarily have to do it, but push comes to shove, we can. And that means knowledge is something that we have to build so that the capability of developing a new technology is something that we always can undertake. We cannot be frozen out like this, as we are at the moment being threatened, as the United States is doing to us. because we don't seem to have anything to threaten the United States with reciprocally, that if you deny us these things, if you want to impose these tariffs, then we will not sell you ABCD goods. That China seems to have shown with rare earths. Similarly, we don't seem to have, or something similar we don't seem to have. So my final words are this, that if we want to compete in science and technology, which is really the motor of industrial and human development today, then it's necessary for you to have certain areas that you think you are in advance of the rest of the world, because only that way a continental-sized economy can protect itself. It is not a small economy like, say, Vietnam or, say, Cambodia or Indonesia. Indonesia is still pretty big. But they are still relative to the size that India, China is. These are really relatively smaller economies. So we need to have something that we do ourselves, and then we need collaborations across a large set of countries to be able to build a bloc which can then say we will not be blackmailed by the United States, the rogue power in the world today. To be able to do that, the fundamental task for us is to build science technology institutions which can build cutting-edge technology, at least in some areas, for us to be able to maintain our self-reliance and also our political independence. Thank you very much. I think I've taken a lot of time, and I've also spent about an hour on this.
ചില സാങ്കേതിക പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ വന്നതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ആദ്യം കുറച്ച് താമസിക്കാൻ ഡിലേ വന്നത്. പ്രബീർ കാസ്തയെ പോലൊരു വ്യക്തിയുടെ പ്രസൻസ് നമുക്കിവിടെ ലഭിക്കുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നതിന് ഞങ്ങളെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം വലിയ സന്തോഷമുള്ളൊരു കാര്യമാണ്. ഈ സെക്ഷന് ഇവിടെ പങ്കെടുത്ത എല്ലാവർക്കും ഔപചാരികമായി ലിബറൈറ്റിൻ്റെ പേരിലും ചിന്ത പബ്ലിഷേഴ്സിൻ്റെ പേരിലും നന്ദി. അടുത്ത സെക്ഷൻ ആരംഭിക്കുകയാണ്.